Act 4, Scene 4, but Chapter 6, page 126. The commissioner looked over his list of possible answers. Posh and tip? He asked. Julian quickly answered. Posh means fashionable, and is the acronym for port out, stop at home, referring to the time when India belonged to Britain, and the people travelling there wanted the shady side of the ship, both going and coming. And tip, meaning the small sum of money given for services rendered, is the acronym for to ensure promptness. The commissioner laughed. You may be a little ahead of us on that one, Epiphany. I don't have either of those acronyms on my list. We'll have to check with our advisory panel. He nodded to the three people sitting at a table on the far side of the room. One rapidly punched keys on a computer as the other two consulted large books. The three of them conferred briefly and passed a note to the commissioner. We can allow Posh, but we do not find a reference for tip. Julian said, With all due respect, sir, I think you ought to check another source. Their path to the state final started with the 6th grade championship. Mrs. Olinski had expected victory, for her team was quick and informed and worked together perfectly. No one had expected them to trounce the other two 6th grades, but they did. Their victory was so profound that the 6th grade math teacher, Mrs. Sharkey, confided to the music teacher, Mrs. Massolino, that for the first time in the history of Epiphany Middle School, there was a chance, just a possibility, mind you, that a 6th grade team might beat the 7th grade team. Mrs. Sharkey said that after all, she knew the 7th grade team, for she had taught them just last year, and in her opinion, when they were very, very good, they were mediocre. The souls practiced during activities hour, that portion of time between 11:30 and 1 o'clock that was not devoted to eating lunch. Mrs. Olinski read questions from note cards. One card, one question. She used 3 sets of questions. The first was a series of questions required of everyone in a particular grade. Knowing that they would be competing with grade 7, she added their questions to her 6th grade set. The second set had been culled from previous contests. Some required only speed. How many quarters and $20? Some required cleverness. If one man could paint an 8-foot by 12-foot wall in a half hour, how long would it take 3 men to paint a wall that was 8 feet by 24 feet? The third set of questions were ones she had made up by weeding items from the news and connecting them to geography or history or both. A masterpiece by the artist Rembrandt was recently stolen from a museum in his native country. What is that country? What is its capital? Mrs. Olinski required that they find the country on a map and then would ask them to name 2 other famous artists, their countries, their capital cities. They beat grade 7, almost doubled their score. Fact, no 6th grade team had ever defeated a 7th grade team. They were scheduled to go up against grade 8. Further fact, no 6th grade had ever competed against the 8th because no 6th grade had ever gotten that far. When word got out that Mrs. Olinski's homeroom had a chance of beating the 8th grade, kids from the other 2 6th grades started signaling a thumbs-up sign when passing a team member in the hall. They raised their arms high overhead and lifted their thumbs like a forest of small apostrophes at the ends of their closed fists. Excitement grew throughout the week. Mrs. Olinski's 6th graders were David versus the 8th grade Goliath, and the kids with the slingshots knew how to use them. Soon the vanquished 7th grade chose sides. They would cheer for grade 6. On Thursday, the day before the showdown, kids from grades 6 and 7 lined the halls between the cafeteria and Mrs. Olinski's room. And gave her and the souls a round of applause as they returned from lunch to practice. Mrs. Olinski smiled and said, thank you, as she wheeled herself between the flanks of honor guards. Traces of her smile remained as the rest of the class filed in for social studies. She sat at her desk and sorted out the papers that were due to be returned. The room was quiet until a student in the back of the room let out an enormous belch and said, not too sincerely, sorry. Mrs. Olinski continued sorting papers before looking up. Hamilton Knapp? Yes, ma'am, he answered. Would you please come to the front? He walked slowly, watching her, a half smile on his face. She let him take his time. Before he reached the front of the classroom, someone launched another belch. Its sound rocketed forward, and the laughter that followed traveled the same trajectory. Mrs. Olinski waited until Ham reached the front of the room before asking, Jared Lord, would you please join Mr. Knapp? Jared also took his time, and Mrs. Olinski did not rush him either. As he ambled down his row toward the front of the room, smiling faces lifted and tilted toward him like the broad front faces of sunflowers as they follow the sun across heaven. Mrs. Olinski allowed that, too. "Now, Mr. Knapp and Mr. Lord," she said, "I would like the two of you to teach the entire class how to belch on command. Please describe the process for all of us." She picked up a piece of chalk from the ledge. "Which one of you wants to take notes on the instructions we're about to receive?" Neither volunteered, so she thrust the chalk into Knapp's hand. "I think you enjoy writing on the blackboard, Mr. Knapp," she said. Ham took the chalk. The class registered its approval with body language that was the equivalent of silent applause. The class waited. "I'll help you with the spelling," Mrs. Olinski said. Ham began to clown around, rolling his eyes and saying, "Well, first you..." The rest of the kids tightened their stomachs, opened their mouths, and tried to figure out how to explain a belch. Jared stood at the blackboard, empty-handed, awkward, uncomfortable, and he too tried to figure it out. Knapp made another attempt. "Well, first you..." Then another long, awkward, uncomfortable wait. "Well, first you..." Mrs. Olinski allowed them to stand there until 3 minutes seemed like 30. Then she sent them back to their seats. "Since you cannot describe what you have done, I would call belching loudly to interrupt our class an unspeakable act. Unspeakable. And because you cannot explain how to do it, I would say that you cannot teach either." She paused, locked eyes first with Knapp and then with Lord before adding, "But I can. If I choose to, I can explain how to belch on command, and I could teach you. If I so choose." She looked at Knapp and Lord again. Her nostrils flared slightly and then turned slowly her head toward the class and added, "But I don't. The front of this classroom is privileged territory. There are only 2 reasons for you to be here. 1, you are teaching something to the rest of the class, or 2, you have been invited. From now on, the only tricks that I'm willing to put up with are those that you can first explain and then teach." She looked at Jared Lord and asked, "Do you understand, Mr. Lord?" Jared attempted a grin. His attempt failed, and he nodded yes. "Then let us have no more interruptions with unspeakable acts. No barking arf, either. Do you understand me, Mr. Knapp?" Ham nodded yes. "Mr. Lord?" Jared said, "Yes, ma'am." As he returned to his seat, no one smiled at Ham or even made eye contact with him. Suddenly, Nadia Diamondstein thrust her left leg straight out into the aisle. Noah Gershom, who was 3 seats in back of her, stuck out his right leg. Ethan Potter saw and raised his right arm in the air, and as if on cue, Julian Singh raised his left fist. For a moment above and below eye level, all 4 limbs stuck out, and then, just as quickly, all 4 disappeared. It was quite a balancing act. Mrs. Lawrenson called the school assembly for the contest against the 8th grade. The principal herself asked the questions. If a team missed its question, the other team had an opportunity to answer. To break a tie, the last team to answer correctly had to correctly answer 1 additional question. This was the question the 8th grade could not answer, and Noah could. Name all the parts of the human eye in the order that light reaches them. This was the 4-part question that they answered to win. Name the famous fathers of Queen Elizabeth I of England, Esau and Jacob, Alexander the Great, and our country. Mrs. Lawrenson was impressed. The 6th grade was jubilant. Mrs. Messalino said she knew it all along, and Mrs. Sharkey said they gave new meaning to the term bottoms up. The Souls were now the team's school. The next step was the contest against Knightsbridge for the district championship.